July 24, 1943, 200 miles southeast of Truk Lagoon, Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit steadies his breathing as he peers through the periscope of USS Tinosa. The crosshairs settle on a prize beyond imagining. Tonan Maru Number Three, 19,000 tons of Japanese tanker, alone, unescorted, dead in the water after 2 perfect torpedo hits. Daspit has 9 fish remaining, 9 chances to send this floating fuel depot to the bottom. He positions Tinosa at 875 yards, textbook range, perfect 90-degree angle. The solution is flawless. Fire 1. The torpedo runs hot, straight, and normal. 30 seconds. Impact. A metallic clang echoes through the hull. No explosion. Fire 2. Another hit. Another clang. Nothing. Fire 3. Hit. Clang. Silence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For the next 2 hours, Daspit fires torpedo after torpedo. Each one tracks perfectly. Each one strikes the target. Each one fails to explode. By the time Tinosa surfaces that evening, Daspit has fired 15 Mark 14 torpedoes, 15 hits, 14 duds. The tanker limps away into the darkness. Daspit returns to Pearl Harbor, carrying something no submarine commander ever wanted, an empty bag, and one precious piece of evidence. The single torpedo he refused to fire. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood meets Daspit at the pier. The young commander's face tells the story before words do. Up in Lockwood's office, Daspit's hands shake as he describes watching perfect shots fail again and again. Lockwood listens in silence. He expected fury, cursing, rage directed at him, at the Bureau of Ordnance, at the torpedo station, at God himself. Instead, Daspit speaks with the quiet exhaustion of a man who has watched impossibility become reality. This wasn't the first report of torpedo failures. It was the most damning, and it represented the culmination of a scandal that had been building since the first week of the war. A scandal rooted not in Japanese superiority or American incompetence, but in something far more insidious, the stubborn refusal of powerful men to admit they were wrong. December 14th, 1941. 1 week after Pearl Harbor, USS Seawolf prowls the waters near the Philippines. Commander Frederick Warder spots a Japanese freighter silhouetted against the dawn. Finally, a chance to strike back. He fires 8 Mark 14 torpedoes, the most advanced submarine weapon in the world. Secret magnetic exploders that would detonate beneath enemy keels. Revolutionary gyroscopic guidance. Precise depth control. The future of naval warfare. 7 torpedoes miss completely. The 8th hits the freighter's hull with an audible thump and fails to explode. The freighter escapes. Warder stares at his plotting board in disbelief. 8 shots, 8 failures. Something is catastrophically wrong. The Mark 14 torpedo represented 15 years of development and millions of dollars in secret research. Designed during the lean Depression years when every penny mattered, when testing budgets vanished and production facilities closed, the weapon emerged from the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, where engineers worked under impossible constraints. The torpedo measured 20 feet long and 21 inches in diameter. It carried a 500-pound explosive warhead. Its steam-driven engine could propel it at 46 knots for 4,000 yards. But the Mark 14's revolutionary feature lay hidden inside a mechanism called the Mark 6 exploder. Instead of requiring a direct hit to trigger detonation, the Mark 6 used magnetic influence. It would sense the steel hull of an enemy ship passing overhead, then explode beneath the keel where no armor protected the vessel's vulnerable underbelly. 1 torpedo, 1 kill, every time. At least, that was the theory. The Mark 6 remained so secret that submarine commanders received almost no information about how it functioned. The Bureau of Ordnance classified the exploder's operating principles at the highest levels. Security concerns prevented realistic testing. Each torpedo cost $10,000, an enormous sum when admirals struggled to pay for paint to maintain their ships. The Bureau conducted exactly 2 live-fire tests of the Mark 6, both in 1926, 17 years before the war began. The first test torpedo ran beneath its target submarine and failed to detonate. The second exploded and sank the target. 50% success rate. The Bureau declared the weapon operational. No one questioned whether 2 tests provided sufficient data. No one considered that Earth's magnetic field varied dramatically between Newport, Rhode Island, and the Central Pacific. No one imagined that the subtle magnetic signatures of different steel alloys might affect the exploder's sensitivity. The Mark VI entered service, carrying assumptions built on hope rather than evidence. Production planning proved equally flawed. When war erupted across the Pacific, American submarine forces possessed fewer than 200 usable torpedoes. The Newport facility, operating on Depression-era budgets, employed 3,000 workers, running 3 shifts, their output 1.5 torpedoes per day. Submarines leaving on war patrol carried perhaps 24 fish. If 8 submarines departed simultaneously, Newport's entire monthly production would be consumed, equipping them for a single cruise. The shortage meant that testing destroyed irreplaceable weapons. Every torpedo fired at a practice target was one less available for combat. Submarine commanders understood this calculation. They preserved their limited supply for actual targets. The Bureau of Ordnance understood it too. They refused to authorize tests that might damage expensive weapons unless absolutely necessary. This frugality created a vicious circle. Problems went undetected because testing was forbidden. When problems emerged in combat, the Bureau blamed submarine crews rather than admitting design flaws. And because crews couldn't test their suspicions without authorization, they couldn't prove the torpedoes were defective. Commander James Coe of USS Skipjack recorded his frustration in May 1942. His patrol report described firing 2 torpedoes at a Japanese transport from 800 yards. Perfect setup. Clear weather. Calm seas. The targets were visible. He watched the first torpedo's smoke wake pass directly under the ship's stern. No explosion. The second torpedo vanished without effect. Coe wrote bitterly in his report, "This was a bitter dose, and I now have little confidence in these torpedoes." Other commanders reported similar failures. Torpedoes that ran too deep, torpedoes that exploded prematurely, torpedoes that hit targets with perfect right-angle impacts and failed to detonate. The clang of steel on steel echoing through submarine hulls as warheads refused to explode. By mid-1942, American submarines had fired over 800 torpedoes. The success rate remained catastrophically low. The Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the failure reports with skepticism bordering on contempt. Their response blamed inexperienced submarine commanders. Faulty tactics, poor maintenance, anything except the possibility that the torpedoes themselves were defective. Official memoranda from Washington emphasized that the Mark XIV and Mark VI represented pinnacles of American engineering. Problems must originate with the men using them. This attitude reflected institutional culture within the Bureau. Engineers and ordnance specialists had spent careers developing these weapons. The magnetic exploder represented a triumph of physics and mechanical design. Admitting flaws would acknowledge that 15 years of work contained fundamental errors. That testing procedures were inadequate. That cost-cutting had compromised weapon effectiveness. Such admissions would threaten careers, damage reputations, and invite congressional scrutiny of budget decisions. So the Bureau held firm. The torpedoes worked. The problem lay with submarine crews. But submarine commanders knew what they had seen. Torpedo wakes running straight and true toward targets, then passing harmlessly beneath hulls. Perfect attacks that should have resulted in kills, producing nothing. Japanese convoys sailing untouched past American submarines, whose commanders watched helplessly as their weapons failed. In Australia, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood assumed command of Southwest Pacific submarines in May 1942. Unlike bureaucrats in Washington, Lockwood had spent decades aboard submarines. He understood the weapons, he trusted his commanders, and he recognized that the failure reports told a consistent story. Something was fundamentally wrong with American torpedoes. Lockwood made a decision that would define his career. He would prove the torpedoes were defective, and he would do it without asking permission. On June 20th, 1942, USS Skipjack arrived at Frenchman Bay near Albany, Australia. A fishing net stretched across the harbour at precisely measured depths. Lockwood himself supervised the test. Skipjack submerged and fired a single Mark 14 set for 10 feet depth. The torpedo struck the net. At 25 feet, the test was repeated. Another torpedo. Same depth setting, 21 feet deep through the net. A third test, 10-foot setting, 18 feet actual depth. The average error measured 11 feet, not the 4 feet that the Bureau had grudgingly acknowledged. 11 feet, enough to send torpedoes beneath most cargo ships without the magnetic exploder ever detecting the target. Lockwood sent his test results to Pearl Harbor and Washington. The response was swift and hostile. The Bureau of Ordnance was not amused. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, was even less pleased. Lockwood had conducted unauthorized tests using irreplaceable torpedoes. He had bypassed proper channels. He had questioned Bureau expertise without authorization. But King was also a pragmatist. He ordered the Bureau to conduct their own depth tests. In August 1942, Newport finally performed proper trials. Their results confirmed what Lockwood had demonstrated. The Mark 14 ran 11 feet deeper than set, not 4 feet. 11 feet. The problem lay in the depth control mechanism. The torpedo sensed water pressure through a small port located in the nose. At high speed, water flowing past the nose created low pressure that falsely indicated shallow depth. The control mechanism compensated by driving the torpedo deeper. This hydrodynamic effect had never been tested, because trials used stationary torpedoes in tanks of still water. Real-world conditions at combat speeds created entirely different pressure patterns. The fix was relatively simple. Relocate the pressure sensor to the torpedo's midsection where flow effects were minimized. Recalibrate the depth control. By late 1942, modified torpedoes began reaching the fleet. Submarine commanders reported immediate improvement. Torpedoes ran at correct depths. Hit rates increased. Maybe the nightmare was over. It wasn't. The depth problem merely masked two even more serious flaws. When torpedoes began running at proper depths, new issues emerged. Premature explosions. Torpedoes detonating hundreds of yards short of targets. The magnetic Mark 6 exploder was triggering early, wasting shots on empty water. Lieutenant Commander John Scott in USS Tunney experienced this failure in its most frustrating form. April 9, 1943. Tunney maneuvered into perfect position inside a Japanese carrier formation near Truk. 3 aircraft carriers. On one side, fleet carrier Hio. On the other, 2 smaller carriers Junyo and Taiyo. Scott was 880 yards from the targets, point-blank range in submarine warfare. He fired all 10 tubes. 4 stern shots, 6 bow shots, 7 torpedoes exploded. Scott and his crew heard each detonation, but no carrier reduced speed. No carrier showed damage. Intelligence later confirmed that all 7 explosions were premature. The magnetic exploders had triggered early, detonating the warheads before they reached their targets. The torpedoes ran true, but the Mark 6 exploder failed. This pattern repeated across the Pacific. USS Trigger fired 6 torpedoes at carrier Hio in June 1943. 2 missed. 1 exploded prematurely. 1 was a dud. 2 hit and damaged the carrier, but failed to sink it. USS Pompano attacked carrier Shokaku by firing 6 torpedoes. Multiple premature explosions. No significant damage. Submarine commanders began compiling statistics. They estimated that 10% of torpedoes exploded prematurely. The Bureau of Ordnance countered that their data showed only 2% premature explosions. The disconnect reflected different data sources. Commanders reported what they observed in combat. The Bureau analyzed what they could document through recovered torpedo parts. The truth lay with the submariners. The Mark 6 magnetic exploder was hypersensitive. Earth's magnetic field varies by location and latitude. The magnetic signatures of steel hulls differ based on metal composition and welding patterns. The Mark VI had been tested in New England waters against American-built ships. Japanese vessels, constructed with different steel alloys and welding techniques in different magnetic latitudes, produced signatures that triggered the exploder early. By May 1943, even the most optimistic officers recognized the magnetic exploder was unreliable. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, the most famous submarine skipper in the Pacific Fleet, returned from patrol having inflicted no damage despite perfect attacks. Morton's failure finally convinced Lockwood that the Mark VI must be deactivated, but Lockwood hesitated. He waited to see if the Bureau might find a fix. The magnetic exploder offered genuine advantages when it worked. Detonating beneath the keel could break a ship's back with one shot. Contact hits against armored hulls might fail to penetrate. If the Bureau could solve the sensitivity problems, the Mark VI would revolutionize submarine warfare. The Bureau sent an expert to investigate. He examined maintenance procedures at the submarine base. He questioned torpedo crews. He inspected storage facilities. His conclusion: the magnetic exploders were fine. The problem was improper crew procedures, poor maintenance, inadequate understanding of the weapon's sophistication. The expert's report infuriated submarine commanders. They had watched perfect attacks fail. They had recovered unexploded torpedoes and examined the exploders. They knew the magnetic mechanism was flawed, but the Bureau refused to acknowledge reality. On June 24, 1943, Lockwood made his decision. He officially ordered what many of his commanders were already doing secretly: deactivate the magnetic exploder. Use only the contact pistol, which required the torpedo to physically strike the target's hull. No more relying on magnetic influence. If American torpedoes were going to sink Japanese ships, they would do it the hard way: direct hits. Submarine crews cheered the order. Finally, they could fight without their own weapons betraying them. No more watching torpedoes explode hundreds of yards short. No more questioning whether perfect attacks would somehow fail. Just point, shoot, hit, sink. Except the problems still weren't over, because deactivating the magnetic exploder exposed the third and final flaw. The contact pistol itself was defective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. July 24, 1943. USS Tinosa. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit fires his 15th torpedo at Tonan Maru Number 3. 15 shots, 14 hits, 14 metallic clangs, 14 failures to explode, 1 torpedo remaining. Daspit makes a decision that will change the course of the Pacific War. He refuses to fire that last fish. Instead, he will bring it home. Evidence, proof, undeniable documentation that something is catastrophically wrong with the contact exploder itself. The return voyage to Pearl Harbor takes 12 days. Daspit composes his patrol report during the journey, every detail documented: range, speed, angle, sea state, target characteristics. A clinical recitation of perfect attacks producing no results. The tanker should have been on the ocean floor within an hour of the first hit. Instead, it escaped, and somewhere in the Japanese merchant fleet, 19,000 tons of fuel continued supporting enemy operations. Lockwood meets Daspit at the submarine pier. The young commander's report is devastating in its precision, but the Bureau of Ordnance will demand proof. They've rejected every previous complaint about torpedo reliability. They've blamed commanders, crews, maintenance procedures, and tactics. They will not accept another failure report without irrefutable evidence. The torpedo Tinosa brought back is examined at the Pearl Harbor torpedo shop. The inspection team finds nothing wrong. Depth mechanism, perfectly calibrated. Gyroscope, functioning normally. Contact pistol, properly assembled. According to every specification, this torpedo should work flawlessly. Lockwood understands that laboratory examination won't reveal combat failures. The torpedo must be tested under conditions that replicate actual impacts. He calls in Commander Charles "Swede" Momsen. If anyone can solve this puzzle, it's Momsen. The man who invented the submarine rescue chamber, who designed the Momsen lung that saved hundreds of submariners from sunken boats. whose habit of questioning official doctrine made him few friends in Washington but earned him the fierce loyalty of submarine crews. Mommsen proposes a test that makes the Bureau nervous: fire live torpedoes at solid targets, not practice shots into nets, not dummy warheads that float to the surface for recovery. Real warheads, real explosives, real combat conditions. Lockwood approves immediately. The Bureau can complain later. August 31st, 1943. USS Muskellunge takes position off the cliffs near Pearl Harbor. Mommsen supervises from the deck. Artillery Officer Commander Art Taylor handles the firing calculations. The first torpedo launches. It strikes the cliff face and explodes. The second torpedo fires. It hits. Explosion. Massive spray of rock and seawater. The third torpedo fires. It hits the cliff. No explosion. Just the characteristic clang that submarine crews had reported for nearly 2 years. Mommsen himself enters the water to examine the unexploded torpedo. It has broken in two. The warhead is split but intact, extremely dangerous. One wrong movement could trigger detonation. Mommsen's team carefully hoists the torpedo onto a barge. Back at Pearl Harbor, they disconnect the warhead and examine the contact pistol. The mechanism is both brilliantly engineered and fatally flawed. The firing pin sits inside a carefully machined housing. Upon impact, inertia drives the pin forward into the detonator. Simple physics, straightforward mechanics, except the firing pin is too heavy, and the contact pistol is simultaneously too rigid and too delicate. Mommsen designs another test, a cherry-picker crane, 90 feet tall, torpedo warheads filled with sand and fitted with live exploders, drop them onto steel plates at different angles and speeds, simulating various impact conditions. 70% fail to explode. 70%. The best shots, the perfect 90-degree angle impacts that submarine commanders were trained to achieve, were the least likely to work. The firing pin hit so hard that it sheared off instead of driving forward into the detonator. Ironic, tragic, maddening. The better the shot, the less likely it would explode. Most kills came from torpedoes that struck at oblique angles, where the firing pin functioned as designed. Submarine commanders achieving textbook attacks were rewarded with duds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The evidence is undeniable now. 3 separate, catastrophic failures. The depth mechanism that sent torpedoes too deep. The magnetic exploder that detonated prematurely. The contact pistol that failed on direct hits. Each problem masked the others. Fix one, and the next emerged. 21 months of war. 21 months of American submarines firing weapons that didn't work while the Bureau of Ordnance insisted the problem was with the men, not the machines. Lockwood flies to Washington in August 1943. At the Submarine Officers Conference, he confronts the Bureau of Ordnance leadership directly. His statement becomes legendary. If the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, then for God's sake, get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off a target's side. Rear Admiral William Spike Blandy, Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, is furious. When Lockwood meets him privately, Blandy barely controls his rage. I don't know whether it's part of your mission to discredit the Bureau of Ordnance, but you seem to be doing a pretty good job of it. Lockwood doesn't back down. Well, Spike, if anything I have said will get the Bureau off its duff and get some action, I will feel that my trip has not been wasted. The confrontation forces the Bureau's hand. They can no longer dismiss the evidence. Mommsen's tests are too conclusive. Daspit's patrol report is too detailed. The statistics are too damning. In September 1943, the Bureau finally redesigns the contact pistol. The solution comes from an unexpected source. During the Pearl Harbor attack, American gunners shot down multiple Japanese aircraft. Engineers examined the wreckage. The propeller blades were made from lightweight alloys that offered the exact properties needed for a firing pin, stronger than the original design. Light enough to avoid shearing on impact, the new firing pins are manufactured and installed in torpedoes throughout the fleet. On September 30th, 1943, USS Barb departs on war patrol, the first American submarine carrying a full load of reliable torpedoes. The Pacific War is already half over, but while the Bureau of Ordnance grudgingly fixed the torpedoes in Washington, submarine crews in the Pacific had been fighting a different battle, a secret war against their own regulations, because long before the official solutions arrived, submariners began fixing the torpedoes themselves, without authorization, without permission. In direct violation of explicit orders from the Bureau of Ordnance, the Mark VI exploder was considered so secret that submarine crews were forbidden from touching it. The Bureau feared that unauthorized access might compromise the classified mechanism, or that inexperienced personnel might damage the delicate components. Official policy was clear. Only authorized personnel at submarine-based torpedo shops could open the exploders. Anyone else who tampered with them would face severe consequences. To enforce this policy, the Bureau ordered that torpedo shops apply dabs of colored paint to the screws, holding the exploder mechanism to the torpedo body. Any attempt to remove the exploder would mar the paint. Evidence of unauthorized tampering would be immediately visible when torpedoes returned to the shop for inspection. The system assumed that fear of punishment would prevent crews from violating regulations. It failed to account for the fury of men who watched their attacks fail because of defective weapons, or the determination of submarine commanders who understood that bureaucratic compliance meant death in combat. The workaround was simple, elegant, completely illegal. Torpedomen visited the submarine base shops and asked casual questions. "What color paint are you using on the Mark 14 exploders?" "Blue." "Thank you." They obtained small cans of matching blue paint. When they removed exploders to make unauthorized modifications, they carefully retouched the screw heads afterward. Unless someone examined the paint under magnification, there was no evidence the mechanism had been touched. What modifications were they making? Primarily, they were deactivating the magnetic influence feature of the Mark VI. This required opening the exploder, disconnecting the magnetic sensing circuit, and ensuring the contact pistol would trigger properly. Technically complex, extremely dangerous if done incorrectly, completely forbidden by the Bureau of Ordnance. But submarine crews did it anyway, because they were fighting a war, and defective weapons killed American sailors just as surely as Japanese torpedoes. When official channels failed, when bureaucrats dismissed their reports, when the Bureau blamed crews instead of admitting design flaws, submariners took matters into their own hands. Officers faced consequences for these actions. Commander Tyrrell Jacobs, commanding USS Sargo on its first war patrol in December 1941, deactivated the magnetic exploders in his torpedoes after watching several premature explosions waste perfect attacks. His patrol report documenting this decision got him into considerable difficulty with the Bureau of Ordnance. Questioning the Mark VI was questioning 15 years of development work. Admitting the magnetic exploder was flawed meant acknowledging that testing had been inadequate, that cost-cutting had compromised effectiveness, that the Bureau had fielded defective weapons. Jacobs' career nearly ended over his decision. Only the desperate shortage of experienced submarine commanders saved him. The Pacific Fleet needed every qualified skipper. Punishing Jacobs for successfully modifying defective torpedoes would send exactly the wrong message to other commanders. So the Bureau issued stern warnings about unauthorized modifications and quietly let the matter drop. Other commanders learned from Jacobs' experience. They made the same modifications, but they documented them more carefully. Or didn't document them at all. By mid-1942, unauthorized torpedo modifications were widespread throughout the Pacific submarine fleet. The Bureau knew it was happening, but short of conducting detailed inspections of every torpedo on every submarine, they couldn't prove it. And even if they could prove it, punishing dozens of submarine commanders during desperate wartime operations would cripple the fleet's effectiveness. So an unofficial policy emerged. Don't ask, don't tell. As long as commanders achieved results, the Bureau wouldn't investigate too closely how they were doing it, and submarine crews understood that if they got caught making unauthorized modifications, they would face consequences. But they also understood that facing court-martial was preferable to dying because bureaucrats refused to fix broken weapons. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood himself operated in this grey zone. His unauthorized depth tests at Frenchman Bay violated explicit Bureau of Ordnance policy. He was ordered not to waste expensive torpedoes on field testing. He did it anyway. When Admiral King ordered official tests, Lockwood had already proven the torpedoes were defective. The Bureau couldn't dismiss his evidence without conducting their own trials, and those trials confirmed what Lockwood had demonstrated through unauthorized testing. Lockwood's defiance of Bureau authority set the tone for the entire Pacific submarine fleet. If the commander of submarines was willing to break regulations to prove torpedoes were defective, individual boat captains felt justified making their own unauthorized modifications. The institutional culture shifted. Following orders became secondary to achieving mission success, and mission success required working torpedoes, regardless of whether the Bureau officially acknowledged the problems. This created a strange dynamic. Officially, the Bureau of Ordnance maintained that Mark 14 torpedoes and Mark 6 exploders were functioning properly. Any problems resulted from crew error or improper maintenance. Unofficially, submarine commanders throughout the Pacific were modifying, adjusting, and fixing the weapons to make them actually work. The Bureau knew this was happening. Submarine crews knew the Bureau knew. But both sides maintained the fiction that everything was proceeding according to official policy. The breakthrough came when the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. Mumson's cliff tests, Daspit's meticulously documented patrol, the cherry-picker drop tests showing 70% failure rates. Lockwood's confrontation with the Bureau leadership in Washington. These created a situation where the Bureau could no longer maintain their position without appearing incompetent or dishonest. Even then, the official solutions came slowly. The depth control fix was implemented in late 1942, 8 months after Lockwood's unauthorized tests proved the problem. The magnetic exploder was officially deactivated in June 1943, 18 months after Commander Jacobs did the same thing without authorization. The contact pistol redesign arrived in September 1943, 21 months after the first combat reports of duds. By the time official fixes reached the fleet, submarine crews had been making unauthorized modifications for over a year. They had learned which changes worked and which didn't. They had developed techniques for opening exploders without damaging them. They had created informal knowledge networks, sharing information about successful modifications between boats and submarine squadrons. The institutional knowledge accumulated by submarine crews exceeded what the Bureau of Ordnance possessed, because crews were testing their solutions in actual combat, while the Bureau relied on laboratory conditions. Historian Clay Blair documented this dynamic in his comprehensive history of the submarine campaign. He wrote, "After 21 months of war, the 3 major defects of the Mark 14 torpedo had at last been isolated. Each defect had been discovered and fixed in the field, always over the stubborn opposition of the Bureau of Ordnance. The field fixes came from the men who used the weapons in combat, not from engineers in Newport, not from Bureau officials in Washington, from submarine commanders who watched their attacks fail, from torpedomen who risked court-martial by opening classified mechanisms, from leaders like Lockwood and Mumson who were willing to defy bureaucratic authority when official channels failed. The cost of this failure is difficult to calculate precisely. How many Japanese ships escaped because American torpedoes didn't work? How many submarine attacks failed because of defective exploders? How many opportunities were lost during the critical first year of the war when Japan held overwhelming advantage? Analysts estimate that reliable torpedoes from the beginning of the war could have shortened the Pacific campaign by 6 months to a year. Every Japanese convoy that escaped because American torpedoes failed delivered supplies to enemy forces. Every tanker that survived carried fuel for aircraft and warships. Every transport that reached port unloaded troops and equipment. The torpedo failures didn't just waste individual attacks, they extended the war. The human cost was equally significant. Submarine crews facing defective weapons took greater risks to achieve hits. They approached closer to targets, increasing vulnerability to Japanese escorts. They extended patrols trying to compensate for failed attacks, spending more time in dangerous waters. Some submarines were lost because they exhausted their torpedo loads on failed attacks and couldn't defend themselves when Japanese forces counterattacked. USS Grunion is believed to have been sunk by one of her own circular-running torpedoes. The defective depth control caused the torpedo to malfunction, turn back, and strike Grunion's periscope tower. The impact jammed the diving controls at full emergency dive, sending the submarine to crushing depth. 70 men died because of a torpedo defect that should have been caught in testing. USS Tullibee was definitely sunk by a circular-running torpedo, though whether it was a Mark 14 or the later Mark 18 remains unclear. 80 men lost. USS Tang was sunk by her own Mark 18 torpedo. 78 men died, with only 9 survivors. These weren't combat losses inflicted by a superior enemy. They were casualties caused by defective American weapons. But despite the failures, despite the bureaucratic obstruction, despite the 21 months of fighting with broken weapons, American submarine forces adapted and prevailed. By late 1943, with reliable torpedoes finally in service, the submarine campaign against Japan became devastating. In 1944, American submarines sank over 600 Japanese vessels, totaling more than 2.4 million tons. In 1945, they sank another 600 ships. By war's end, submarines had destroyed over 1,300 Japanese vessels, displacing nearly 5 million tons, 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. Gone. The island nation's economy depended on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. When submarines severed these supply lines, Japan's war industry collapsed. The submarines also sank over 200 Japanese warships, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers. Even battleships fell to submarine torpedoes. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which began the war with qualitative and numerical advantage, was systematically destroyed. By 1945, Japanese capital ships rarely left port because fuel shortages and submarine threats made operations too dangerous. This success came despite the torpedo scandal. Imagine what submarine forces could have accomplished with reliable weapons from the beginning. The first 2 years of the war, when Japan held the initiative, when American forces were retreating across the Pacific, submarines could have inflicted far greater damage if their torpedoes had worked properly. The strategic impact of earlier submarine success might have shortened the war significantly. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood retired after the war, with a reputation as one of the Navy's most effective commanders. His willingness to challenge the Bureau of Ordnance, to conduct unauthorized tests, to defend his submarine commanders against bureaucratic blame, earned him legendary status among submariners. They called him Uncle Charlie, a term of respect and affection rarely applied to flag officers. Lockwood had listened to his subordinates. He had believed their reports. He had fought for them against powerful institutional resistance. Submarine crews never forgot that. Commander Swede Mommsen continued his career of innovation and unorthodox thinking. His torpedo tests at Pearl Harbor confirmed what submarine crews had been reporting for 2 years. But more importantly, his willingness to conduct dangerous live-fire tests, to risk his own life examining unexploded ordnance, to challenge official doctrine with empirical evidence, demonstrated the kind of leadership that wins wars. Mommsen's methods were often unconventional. His results were undeniable. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit's decision to save that final torpedo from Tinosa's failed attack provided crucial evidence that forced the Bureau to act. His meticulously documented patrol report couldn't be dismissed as crew error or poor tactics. He had executed textbook attacks under ideal conditions. The torpedoes had run true. They had struck the target. They had failed to explode. The Bureau could blame commanders for missing shots. They couldn't blame Daspit for torpedoes that hit but didn't detonate. The submariners who secretly modified their torpedoes, who violated regulations to make their weapons actually work, who risked court-martial rather than die with defective ordnance, these men saved the submarine campaign. Their names are mostly forgotten. They didn't receive medals for unauthorized torpedo modifications. Official histories gloss over the systematic violation of Bureau of Ordnance regulations, but their actions were as crucial to victory as any medal-winning attack. The torpedo scandal revealed fundamental problems with how military bureaucracies develop and field weapons. The Bureau of Ordnance operated with minimal oversight, developing the Mark 14 in secrecy with inadequate testing. Cost constraints and security concerns prevented realistic trials. When problems emerged in combat, institutional pride prevented the Bureau from admitting errors. They blamed users rather than acknowledging design flaws. The scandal also demonstrated the importance of feedback between combat forces and development agencies. Submarine commanders reported torpedo failures from the first week of the war. The Bureau dismissed these reports for 21 months. If proper channels had existed for combat testing and rapid modification, the problems could have been fixed by mid-1942. Instead, bureaucratic resistance extended the crisis for nearly 2 years. Modern weapon development incorporates lessons from the torpedo scandal, extensive testing under realistic conditions, rapid feedback from operational units, willingness to acknowledge and correct problems quickly. The assumption that combat forces might identify issues that laboratory testing missed. These principles seem obvious now. They weren't obvious in 1942. The Mark 14 torpedo remained in service until 1980, nearly 40 years. Once the problems were fixed, it proved to be an effective weapon. The basic design was sound. The magnetic exploder, while troublesome during World War II, was eventually perfected for conditions in different oceans. The depth control and contact pistol modifications made the weapon reliable. Submarines in later decades used Mark 14s successfully in training and limited combat operations, but the weapon's legacy is forever tied to its failures. The torpedo scandal became a case study taught at military academies, war colleges, and defense acquisition courses. How not to develop weapons, how not to respond to field reports, how not to prioritize bureaucratic authority over combat effectiveness. The scandal demonstrated that technical excellence means nothing if weapons don't work under actual combat conditions. The submarine crews who fought with defective torpedoes, who made unauthorized modifications, who found ways to accomplish their missions despite institutional failures, these men embodied the American military's greatest strength: adaptability, initiative. Determination to find solutions rather than accepting failure. They were told their weapons were perfect, and they were using them wrong. They proved the weapons were broken and fixed them anyway. They were ordered not to test torpedoes. They tested them. They were forbidden from opening exploders. They opened them. They were threatened with consequences for unauthorized modifications. They modified anyway, because they understood something that bureaucrats in Washington failed to grasp. Following regulations that guarantee failure is not courage, it's suicide. Real courage means taking responsibility for success, even when that requires violating orders. Real leadership means protecting subordinates from institutional failures. Real professionalism means achieving mission objectives regardless of obstacles, including obstacles created by your own side. The torpedo scandal lasted 21 months, from December 1941 to September 1943. During that time, American submarines sank approximately 150 Japanese ships, totaling roughly 600,000 tons. Impressive numbers. But with reliable torpedoes from the beginning, those numbers could easily have been doubled or tripled. The strategic impact of lost opportunities during those 21 months extended the Pacific War and cost thousands of American lives. Yet the scandal also revealed the resilience of the submarine force. They adapted, they improvised, they overcame bureaucratic obstruction through unauthorized action. They found ways to fight effectively despite being issued defective weapons. When the official system failed, they created an unofficial system that worked. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, eventually recognized the submarine force's struggles. He supported Lockwood's challenges to the Bureau of Ordnance. He defended submarine commanders against accusations of incompetence. He ensured that combat feedback reached decision-makers in Washington. Nimitz understood that institutional pride should never outweigh combat effectiveness. The Japanese never fully understood why American submarine attacks were so ineffective during 1942 and early 1943. They attributed it to poor training or conservative tactics. They failed to implement strong anti-submarine defenses because American submarines seemed less dangerous than they actually were. This complacency proved fatal when reliable torpedoes reached the fleet in late 1943. By then, Japanese defenses were inadequate to stop the submarine onslaught. The merchant marine was systematically destroyed. The Navy was driven from the seas. Japan's war economy collapsed. If American torpedoes had worked properly from the beginning, Japan might have recognized the submarine threat earlier and implemented stronger defenses. The ultimate success of the submarine campaign might have been reduced. So in a strange way, the torpedo scandal's timing worked in America's favor. Japan was lulled into complacency by early submarine failures, then devastated when the problems were fixed and submarines became truly effective. But this fortunate accident doesn't excuse the institutional failures that caused the scandal. American sailors died because bureaucrats refused to admit mistakes. Opportunities were lost because pride trumped evidence. The Pacific War was extended because testing was inadequate and feedback was ignored. These failures were preventable. They resulted from choices made by people who prioritized their careers and reputations over combat effectiveness. The men who fixed the problems, often in violation of regulations, deserve recognition. They saw what needed to be done and did it. They accepted the risks of unauthorized action because the alternative was accepting defeat. They trusted their own observations over official doctrine. They proved that institutional authority must be questioned when it conflicts with reality. This is the real story of how Submariners' illegal torpedo modifications sank the Japanese fleet, not through official channels, not through proper procedures, not through bureaucratic approval, through determination, through courage, through willingness to defy authority when authority was wrong, through unauthorized tests, forbidden modifications, and secret fixes that made broken weapons finally work. The Mark 14 torpedo eventually became reliable, but not because the Bureau of Ordnance designed it properly, because submarine crews fixed it themselves, in the field, under fire, without permission, in direct violation of explicit orders. They fought two wars simultaneously, one against Japan, one against their own bureaucracy. They won both. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.